So welcome to our webinar, Asia Sourcing 2026, New Risk, New Sourcing Strategies. In today's discussions, we will look at the evolving sourcing landscape, why Asia and Vietnam remain on buyer radar, and key insights from real sourcing experiences in the regions. Joining us today as our partner is Move to Asia, a company that provides end-to-end solutions for businesses looking to source and purchase products in Vietnam. We are honored to welcome Mr. Guillaume Rondan, CEO and founder of Move to Asia.
Hello, everyone. I'm currently based in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and hopefully today we will discuss the in and out about the latest risks, what's happening worldwide, and how buyers should implement or at least think about the supply chain and especially diversifying the supply chain. So, quick introduction about myself. I've been in Vietnam for about 10 years, and I'm the founder of Move to Asia. We provide A to Z sourcing services from supplier identification to quality control and to being the local team on behalf of our clients on the ground with our main market as Vietnam. Let's start by a few flashpoints, and I think some of the headlines that I will put on my screen will resonate with many of you. So we see US-China tension with President Donald Trump. We see as well the EU strengthening their regulations for imports and then regulations. Taiwan as well matter here in the Asia side, as well as the latest Iran-USA war and what's happening on the Hormuz territory as well. So basically, those headlines brings volatility and risk on the supply chain. So for companies, they can be from small to mid to even large SME and as well as MNC. What they have and what they experience are higher costs, less predictability on the supply chain, as well as more risk to have a sustainable and well-diversified procurement. As we can see, risks are not anymore exceptional. They are structural and they are part of almost every day. And probably 10, 15 years ago, only large corporations were looking into this diversification topic. Now almost anyone are having those questions, those matters. And of course, this is very tangible things to have in mind because it's not just anymore having bad luck into the supply chain, but it's just what is common and our current environment. That's why we need to be able to put more resilience on our supply chain. And what do we expect basically on paper? I'm dealing with companies that have built a supply chain for 20, 30, 40 years in China. And very often they are very used to this market. So they will expect probably just to send pictures, RFQs to factories, and then receive within a couple of days immediate quotes. And that's not the reality when you are moving to a different market. When you are going to other places in Asia, it can be India, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, but it can also be closer to Europe, Turkey, or also in Mexico. The reality of how those supply chains are built and how factories are equipped to answer accordingly are very different. Obviously, there will be a lot of groundwork to do. You need to have a team there that will be able to do all this assignment to make sure that in terms of capabilities of a certain market, this is matched. And when you have a production that is moved to those markets, you need to be also hands-on and being able to also accompany your supplier with the production ramp-up. That's one of the things that is a must-have if you are looking and thinking about moving your supply chain outside of China. Let me highlight you two cases to really also explain about the mindset and how companies are usually approaching this de-risking of their supply chain in this 2026, I would say, geopolitical and then instability worldwide and how people are thinking. I had a phone call, I think it was a month or a month and a half ago, from a large US corporation looking to move their production outside of China. They have been building it for more than 20 years. And then through our discussion and preliminary assessment about their plan to go to Vietnam, we raised immediately some red flag in a certain way, or at least we provided them our honest feedback on how they should approach this supply chain diversification. And the first thing was about the assumption about everything will be the same in a different market to what they know from China. One of the first things that they were asking is about, I'm going to send pictures and I'm going to receive quotations. And it's not the right mindset to have when you are looking at a different market because the capacity and how factories are working are very different. buyers need to be very hands-on and needs to be really providing a lot of information and always working very closely with factories. And that's something that could be assumed as granted because they approach factories from a buyer perspective. And sending technical drawings, tech pack are very common in Vietnam. Many of the factories will do it, and it's the same in many markets outside of China. And basically, when there is a production ramp up, also looking into setting up your own team in country is also a must-have. So for this, I would say case study. It was more a discussion that we have with someone looking at Vietnam. You need to have enough understanding and then analyzing about certain markets before moving fully your supply chain. And what could be basically the risk if you don't do that proactively or enough, with a lot of ownership into building your supply chain elsewhere? You may obviously have execution risks, which will put your supply chain on danger, and then obviously it can impact a lot of things. The first thing that it can impact will be obviously quality. When you are moving from a market A to a market B, then the SOPs in terms of quality control in the factory will be obviously different. So you have to rethink about what you may have done 15, 20 years ago and not assume that it's going to be the same in a different market. So putting clear specifications are one thing, but also putting your own team or a third-party team in the factory will drastically help to reduce the quality aspects. Now about the cost factor as well, and I will highlight it on another example right after. The cost in a certain market will be totally different from the supply chain that you may have built. You can expect just 20%, I would say, on the minimum, or it can be 50%, or sometimes in some market it can be multiplied by 2 or by 3. So don't expect that when you copy-paste something, you will get the same pricing or even lower price because supposedly what you read online, the labor cost is lower. So obviously the end for the cost will be lower. That's not always the case. Finally, commercial risk. When you have this 2026 volatility market with a lot of unpredictability, supply chain is at risk, meaning that factories are also more at risk, I would say, than before. And then if a big client is cashing out from a factory or moving the supply chain, your own supply chain or your new suppliers may be financially or operationally at risk, which can lead to commercial issues as well. Now, let's move to a second way of thinking, building supply chain. And for this case, you see the mindset of our European client was quite different. They actually conducted their first visit in 2018. So they came for the first time in Vietnam. It was not with our agency. They come almost 10 years ago with the first idea about I'm going to move out my supply chain that I have been building for, I think, 30 or 40 years in China. I'm going to try to build it in Vietnam. Back in 2018, the capacity was very limited in terms of factories, and just there were not the raw material that they were looking for. So obviously the pricing was not competitive. The market was not mature enough to consider moving it. They came for a second time around 2022, right before COVID, and then they could have a better, I would say, feeling about the market, but yet not everything was good. And then they reached out to us in 2025. We have made an update assignment about what's the current capabilities. And they just arrived here a couple of weeks ago. They had the first understanding and first tour of Vietnam. We realized that now, so in a 10-year time frame, we have local supply chain that is more mature because from the raw material to the capability of factories, things are in Vietnam, and actually they are from Vietnamese own factories. We are not even thinking about FDI, factories that are foreign, that receive foreign direct investment. That could be from Korea, from China, or from any other markets. These are Vietnamese owned factories in Vietnam. So in that 10-year time frame, the capabilities are now here. And obviously in terms of price point, we're getting closer to the price that they have in China. So this, what does it mean? It means that when you are looking at this alternative supply chain, you should not think about copy-paste, something that can be done overnight, but it's more something that you have to think along the way and do it strategically, and so it's relevant for the long run. So these are some of the misunderstanding, and then also how basically you would have to approach this supply chain. As I emphasized it already earlier, but I think it's good to say it again, it's not an overnight shift, and you have to build it parallelly to your current supply chain, and then you have to think about tier and sourcing. So let's say you will start by the assembly line in a certain country, and then after that, after you can isolate these this partner or these network of potential partners. Then you will try to build and then go into the different subcontractors to understand about the whole value chain in a certain country. Obviously, if you are looking at Vietnam, many of the raw material will be imported, so you still have some type of dependency from China. Now, about the cost reduction, this is not because the Vietnam labor cost is lower that the end product price will be lower. Very often, these are just distributed costs. You may benefit, yes, from a lower cost of labor, but other aspects, there is less automation in Vietnam. When you look at the infrastructure, this is less lean, for example, than in China. So obviously, when you look at the end price before export, you may be already higher than what you have in China. So you have to consider the whole thing, but also remember about your DDP landed costs in the foreign market. So if you are looking at a product that will be exported to the US with different duties, this is also the metrics that you have to track and then to have a certain idea to also evaluate different markets when you are looking at resilience and diversification in your supply chain. This is not something that is done faster and then leaner. It's not because you have 10 years ahead compared to maybe something that you have built 10 years ago that things are getting faster. So lead time may increase, and also the transition time may be a heavy and lengthy process. But again, remember that the more we are heading and the more there are risks, so the earlier you start, the better is it for the future. And finally, this is not a one-off thing. Think about enriching and diversifying your current supply chain. Start by one, and then after trying to map different subcontractors and then different partners that could also be providing to your whole value chain a benefit in a certain market. And obviously, this is not just China+1. Now we are thinking about China+N. So look at different clusters and then different markets. I know the interview of Pietro, after we'll be speaking about different markets from Malaysia to Vietnam and how those markets can be relevant to each other. So you can get a better understanding about that. Finally, moving the supply chain out doesn't necessarily eliminate the risk. It's just spread the risk around different markets. But obviously, right now, with the chaotic time that we are facing, when it's about supply chain, and if your supply chain is splitted, but you have something happening with the current Iran situation, then obviously you may have issues along the way, along your supply chain. This is not just a manufacturing issue. This is a whole thing that you have to consider. So how do you manage this in reality on the ground? These are some takeaways and something that we usually do to, again, build supply chain on behalf of our clients. But when you are mapping different markets, first start, does this actually make sense for my own product category? Some markets will be better than others. So doing that groundwork may save you a couple of months to make sure that there is actual capabilities within a certain market. Then invest in that supply chain diversification early. Again, the weeks and then the months that you are taking early on will lead to a better and faster success in the future. So be aware about that time aspect. About the technical readiness as well, understand that in some markets, we are not yet at the stage of China. So a factory in China that will be able to almost re-engineer and then design and do all the R&D may not be the certain thing that is right now available elsewhere. So be aware about that gap that it can be taken. That will request you to provide all technical requirements and then closely work with the factory to help them build up this first sample. And when you have the production ramp up, also be closely monitoring the first iteration of your production. That's something that is key. Plan your transition time early. I recall some clients that were telling me, I need to move within 3 months my supply chain and put 30, 40, 50% in Vietnam. That's not realistic. You need few months before, I would say at least 1 year, so you can really do the groundwork effectively and make sure that when you are engaging with a supplier, they have the right one, they have the capacity, and they can be a long supplier for you. Finally, again, align this with their current capabilities and not just pick suppliers around, but really try to do that groundwork that will save you a lot of hassles along the way. Think early, plan, and then prepare accordingly, and it's going to bring results for a resilient supply chain. Thank you, and I will be after joining the Q&A if you have some question for me.
So our first questions come from Wendy. So the question is, for companies shifting from China to Vietnam, what are the most common mistakes in supplier selections and cost calculations they should avoid? I invite Mr. Guillaume Rondan to share your thought on these questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lynchy. And I think it's a great question and a very important issue that many buyers have when they are moving the supply chain outside of China. Basically, something that I can share is very often when you read company profile, let's say you will reach out 10, 20 companies, you may have a few that are going to answer you and send their company profile. Always make sure that you're going to visit the premises of the factories, so the manufacturers, in person. So either by yourself, so you fly to Vietnam, or you engage a third-party team in country that will assess the veracity of the information that they will share, because sharing information remotely over email, this is not always the same thing that is happening in factory. In terms of the industrial regulations in Vietnam is getting stricter and stricter to meet with European and US standards. So for instance, most of the regulated sectors, the factories will be only allowed to be set up into some specific industrial lands and zones, but still you find sometimes factories that are not fully complying, and then this is not only for Vietnam, but for the whole Southeast Asia, about the local regulation. And I remember myself visiting a factory a few months ago when we asked about the waste treatment. The person was inviting us to go at the end of the warehouse behind a supposed black door, and behind this there were not proper waste treatment control and then procedures. So you imagine where the waste are heading. So that's why visiting the premises by yourself, you are sure that when you are engaging with a supplier, you know who you be dealing with, and you sure that you can enforce those ethical aspects, and you can make sure that everything is aligned with your own standards and your own expectations. So that's the first thing I would like to share for the audits. That is very important. And finally, for the cost issue, I would invite buyers to come first and then to discuss those cost matters face to face. It's always better to bring ideas and then negotiating pricing face to face. Here in Vietnam, at least, factories that appreciate that. They appreciate to know who they are dealing with, and they want to know about your long-term plan. Are you a serious buyer, and are you looking to do business for them for the long term? Then if yes, then they will be willing to provide suitable competitive pricing, and also share sometimes some target price. I remember it was just 2 weeks ago, I brought a European client to an outdoor furniture factory, and when they could share about the target price, the factory immediately say, we have 2 sources of teak wood. So this is wood species used for outdoor furniture. One is coming from Laos, so without any certificates. And then another one is coming from South America, full with all the FSC certificates. So depending on that, there were 15% differences. So by sharing those target price early on in the discussion, you can also ensure that suppliers may be capable, but just using another type of wood for this example, or another type of material to meet with your expected target price. So when you are discussing further, you know that at least on this type of price point, you are aligned.
Well, thank you, Mr. Guillaume, for that very insightful answer. I believe that this will be very helpful for businesses that are interested in sourcing in Vietnam and Asia.